The man writing in the ledger paused. He had been in the field for 11 months. He had crossed deserts that had no names in any language he spoke. He had buried 2 companions along the way, one to fever and one to something the local people called the wind sickness, a thing his theology had no category for. He was a Franciscan friar named Juan Miguel de Menchero, and he was sitting in the thin light of an adobe room somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico in the year 1744, and he was trying to find the right words. What he had seen that morning, walking out from the settlement toward the canyon rim, was a flock of sheep moving across a mesa that, by every measure he had been trained to apply, should not have been able to support them. There was no water he could identify. The grass was the color of dust. The wind was sharp and carried sand that worked its way into the corners of his eyes and the seams of his robe. And yet the sheep moved steadily, led by a woman he estimated to be no older than 40, her hair wrapped against the wind, her eyes reading the ground the way a priest reads a text he has known since childhood. Behind her, 2 children, barefoot, their feet finding the same invisible path. Ahead of them, the flock spread and gathered and spread again like a single breathing thing, and the woman tracked it all without looking directly at anything. She knew where every animal was. Menchero wrote, "These people understand their animals and their land in ways that I am not yet able to explain." He meant it as an observation. It turned out to be the only honest sentence in a century of Spanish documents about the Diné. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The story of the Navajo and their sheep is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of the American frontier. It is the story of a people who took an animal brought to their land by colonizers, carried it into canyons and high desert and terrain no European livestock manager would have dared, and built from it a civilization so finely adapted to the land that Spanish priests, officers, and administrators, men who had come to this country assuming they were bringing knowledge to people who had none, found themselves writing with something that, if you read their words carefully, begins to look like awe. The story does not end well, the way most true stories from this era do not end well. There is a long march. There is the burning of orchards. There is an army officer who understood, too late, that what he had been ordered to destroy was not a military asset, but a people's entire way of living. But there is also something that survived, and the survival is the point. The survival is why the Spanish priests kept writing. The survival is why those words are still in the archives in Santa Fe, patient and precise, waiting for someone to come and read them clearly. We need to start before the sheep. The Diné, the people the Spanish called the Navajo, were not always shepherds. This is one of those facts that seems obvious once stated, but which popular history has largely buried under 2 centuries of image-making. By the time American painters and photographers arrived in the Southwest in the mid-1800s, the Navajo had been sheep herders for so long and had adapted the practice so thoroughly into every aspect of their spiritual and economic life that it was easy to imagine they had always been this way, that the sheep had always been there, that the looms had always been turning. They had not. The Diné arrived in the Four Corners region of the Colorado Plateau somewhere between the year 1000 and 1400, depending on which archaeological evidence and which oral traditions you weight most heavily. They came from the north, from a people linguistically related to the Athabascan speakers of Canada and Alaska, and what they brought with them was a hunter-gatherer tradition, mobile, adaptive, built for cold and scarcity, and the kind of careful reading of terrain that comes from following game rather than fencing it. When they arrived in the high desert canyon country, they found the Pueblo peoples already there, already building their multi-story stone houses, already growing corn in carefully managed fields, already weaving cotton into textiles that Spanish observers would later compare to the best cloth in Spain. The Diné and the Pueblo peoples were not always at peace. Navajo raids on Pueblo settlements were documented and documented again, and the Spanish who arrived in force in 1598 with Juan de Oñate's colonizing expedition found themselves in a country where the relationships between peoples were complicated, deep, and not easily mapped onto the European categories of ally and enemy. What Oñate brought with him, among the soldiers and the settlers and the Franciscan missionaries and the 83 wagons and the thousands of head of livestock, was the Churra sheep. The Churra, which American frontiersmen later renamed the Chuo, was an old Spanish breed, descended from ancient Iberian stock, lean-framed, long-legged, and possessed of one quality above all others that made it valuable in the high desert. It could survive on almost nothing. It had been bred on the dry plains of Castile and Andalusia for 1,000 years, through droughts and winter storms and the grinding poverty of the Spanish backcountry. It did not need rich pasture. It did not need abundant water. It could read marginal land the way a poor man reads a market, finding what nourishment existed in places where a more pampered animal would starve. Coronado had actually brought the first Churra north in 1540, in the initial sweep that led his men to the Pueblo of Oaxaca. But Coronado found no gold and retreated to Mexico, and the sheep that survived his expedition scattered, some taken by Pueblo peoples, some running wild in the river valleys. It was Oñate's 1598 colonization, the one that brought settlers and missions and the grinding machinery of colonial administration, that established permanent Spanish flocks in the upper Rio Grande Valley. And it was from those Spanish flocks that the Diné began to acquire their own animals. They did not acquire them politely. The earliest Navajo sheep came through raids on Spanish outposts and Pueblo settlements, the same mobile raiding tradition the Diné had always practiced. A flock taken here, a few animals traded there, the slow accumulation of a herd by people who had not yet decided what kind of people sheep owners were going to make them. The Spanish records from the first half of the 17th century note the Navajo presence as a nuisance, a threat, a people who took things and moved before the soldiers could respond. Then came 1680. The Pueblo Revolt, the uprising organized in absolute secrecy by the San Juan Pueblo leader Pope, drove the Spanish out of New Mexico entirely for 12 years. 400 settlers were killed. 21 of the 33 Franciscan missionaries in New Mexico died. The governor, Antonio de Oderman, was forced to lead his surviving people on a long retreat south to El Paso, abandoning everything they had built in 80 years of colonial administration. And in the chaos and the upheaval and the burning of missions, the livestock scattered. The Diné picked up the pieces. Thousands of Churra sheep, suddenly ownerless, their herds broken and dispersed across the high desert, were gathered by Navajo families who understood, perhaps better than the Spanish themselves, what the animals were worth in this landscape. The Apaches, who also took sheep in the aftermath of the revolt, ate them. The Diné kept them, bred them, and began to learn. What followed over the next half-century was one of the most rapid and complete transformations in the documented history of a people's way of life. The Diné did not simply add sheep to an existing economy. They built a new civilization around them. By the time the Spanish returned to New Mexico in 1692, under Governor Diego de Vargas with new orders to be more careful this time, to leave the kivas alone and respect the old ceremonies, the Diné had established themselves as shepherds of a different order from anything the Spanish had seen. Their flocks were not managed in the European manner, with fixed pastures and seasonal rounds decided by landowners. The Diné used a system of transhumance that had no equivalent in the Spanish tradition, moving their flocks across the vertical landscape of the Colorado Plateau in a careful rotation that matched the animals to whatever the desert was offering at any given time of year. Winter valleys, spring mesas, summer high country. The routes were known, the timing was known, and the knowledge of where water could be found and where grass persisted through drought was held and transmitted across generations with the same care that European guilds transmitted the secrets of a craft. The Spanish priests, trying to minister to a people who moved like this, had a difficult time. The Franciscans had been built for the Pueblo model, a settled community, a mission at its center, the calendar of agricultural work and religious festival imposed on a people who had always been farmers. The Diné refused this. They were not farmers in that sense. They were herders, and herders move, and the priests had to choose between following them or acknowledging that the model they had been trained for did not apply. Some of them followed, and what they saw when they followed changed what they wrote. The document that historians most often cite from this period is Menchero's report of 1744, the same friar whose words opened this story. Menchero had been sent to assess the state of missionary work in the territory and to report back on the peoples the church had not yet reached. His account of the Navajo is remarkable for what it chooses to notice and, more importantly, for the gap between what he was supposed to write and what he actually wrote. He was supposed to document a people in need of salvation, a people in spiritual darkness, a people whose practices needed to be corrected and whose economy needed to be reorganized along Spanish lines. Instead, he wrote about a woman on a mesa who knew where every sheep in her flock was without looking directly at any of them. He wrote about flocks that thrived in country that he, Menchero, could not imagine feeding a Spanish horse for a single day. He wrote about the blankets. He gave considerable space, more than his superiors probably wanted, to the blankets. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Navajo had been learning to weave long before the sheep arrived. Cotton, and before cotton, yucca fiber and other plant materials had been worked on Pueblo-style looms for centuries in the Four Corners region, and the Diné had absorbed this technology from their Pueblo neighbors during the complicated centuries of contact and conflict and occasional refuge that preceded the Spanish era. When the Churra wool became available, the Diné weavers did something that no Spanish textile producer had thought to do with this particular fiber. They refined it. The Churra's fleece is double-coated. The inner layer is fine and soft. The outer layer is long and somewhat coarse. The Spanish had used the animal primarily as a source of meat and secondary income, selling its wool into a market that mixed it with other fibers and did not treat it as anything remarkable. The Diné separated the inner and outer fibers, used different spinning techniques for each, and produced a yarn of unusual luster, resilience, and consistent color that dyed with the native plants of the desert in ways no European dye could quite match. The blankets that resulted were not decorative items. They were survival technology. A Navajo blanket woven from Churra wool was, by the mid-18th century, the warmest, most waterproof, most durable piece of portable shelter available anywhere in the American Southwest. Spanish soldiers bought them. Spanish merchants traded for them. By 1812, a colonial official named Pedro Pino wrote, in a report to the Spanish government, that the Navajo were the best weavers in the province. This was not a compliment offered grudgingly to the less fortunate. This was a professional assessment, delivered in a document about economic resources, noting that the textiles produced by a people the Spanish had been trying to convert and control for a century were superior to anything the Spanish settlers themselves could produce. The priests understood this differently from the merchants. What the merchants saw was a product. What the priests saw, when they were paying attention, was the system that produced it. Women owned the flocks. This is the part of the record that consistently surprised Spanish observers and that they consistently had trouble fitting into their existing categories. In Navajo society, the sheep belonged to the women, not in a technical or legal sense imported from somewhere else, not as a formal property arrangement, but as a deep cultural reality that shaped everything else. A woman's status in her community was measured, in significant part, by the size of her flock and the quality of her weaving. When a couple married, the man moved into the wife's family's compound, not the other way around. The animals were hers. The loom was hers. The knowledge of where to take the flock in the dry months, which water sources remained reliable, which canyons offered shelter from the winter storms that came off the high mountains without warning, all of this was transmitted from mother to daughter across generations. Menchero was not the only priest who wrote about this. A generation earlier, an ecclesiastical report from the 1710s noted with obvious bewilderment that among the Navajo, it was impossible to negotiate with the men alone about anything involving the flocks, because the flocks did not belong to the men. The writer was trying to document an obstacle to mission administration. He was, without intending to, documenting a complete and functioning economic system built on principles that had no equivalent in the society he had come from. The sheep and the women and the canyons formed a single thing. The Churra had been bred over 1,700 years on the dry plateaus of Iberia to eat sagebrush and survive on minimal water. The Navajo took that animal and pushed its adaptations further, selecting for hardiness, for the ability to travel long distances without flagging, for a maternal instinct strong enough that ewes rarely abandoned their lambs even in the worst conditions, for a coat that could be shorn twice a year and would still be growing vigorously when the summer heat arrived. They turned a tough Spanish breed into something tougher, something specifically built, over 2 centuries of careful selection, for the exact landscape the Diné called home. A Spanish rancher in New Mexico, Watching a Navajo flock move through country that his own merino sheep would have died in within a week. Once asked a Navajo herder how the animals survived on what the desert offered. The herder's answer, as recorded by a nearby Franciscan who wrote it into his notes without fully understanding its implications, was that the sheep knew the land because the land knew the sheep. The friar wrote this as an example of pagan mysticism, the kind of statement that confirmed his assessment that these people needed the rational light of Christian theology. What the herder was actually describing was something it would take European ecologists 2 more centuries and the development of the discipline of ethology to fully articulate: the coevolutionary relationship between a domesticated animal and the specific terrain it has been bred to inhabit over generations. The sheep knew the land. They had been selected for centuries to know it. The people who selected them had done so not through accident or sentiment, but through the accumulated observation of what survived and what did not, what the land could provide and what it could not, how to move through a country that punished the careless and rewarded the patient. This is what the Spanish priests were writing about, without quite knowing how to name it. By 1800, the Navajo held flocks that numbered in the tens of thousands, possibly higher. The estimates from Spanish records vary and cannot be taken as precise, but all of them agree on the scale. This was not a subsistence economy of a few dozen animals per family. This was a pastoral civilization of considerable productive capacity, generating not only the blankets that provisioned Spanish soldiers and fed a trade network stretching from Taos to Chihuahua, but also meat and milk and hide and the dense, self-contained economic logic of a people who had found in the Chuo sheep a kind of mobile wealth that could not easily be taxed, could not easily be taken, and could be moved at a moment's notice to wherever the land offered sustenance. The canyon country helped. Canyon de Chelly, the great system of red sandstone canyons in what is now northeastern Arizona, was the heart of Navajo country by the early 19th century. The Diné called it Say, the Rock Canyon, and they had been living in and around it for generations, farming the canyon floor where the cottonwoods grew and the river ran sweet in spring, grazing their flocks on the canyon rim in summer when the high country offered cool air and grass, descending again to the sheltered warmth of the sandstone walls when winter came down off the mountains with the kind of cold that killed unprotected animals in a night. The canyon was many things. It was a fortress, its walls 500 feet tall in places, its access routes known only to those who had been raised in its geography. It was a garden, its floor producing peach orchards planted by the Spanish but cultivated by the Diné into something that fed thousands of people through the lean months. It was a home in the most complete sense. The architecture of the Diné's lives had been shaped around it, and the canyon's architecture had, over generations, been shaped by them. Spanish officers who were sent to negotiate with Navajo leaders at Canyon de Chelly in the early 19th century wrote back to Santa Fe with the same quality of reluctant admiration that runs through Menchero's reports 60 years earlier. They had been sent to assert authority. What they found was a people whose authority over their own landscape was so complete, so practically grounded, so impossible to counter on any practical level, that the negotiation tended to go differently than planned. The Navajo leaders they met were not petitioners at the Spanish court. They were men and women who knew exactly where the water was, who could move 10,000 animals in a day if the situation required it, whose blankets were keeping Spanish soldiers warm on mountains the soldiers themselves could not have navigated without Navajo guides. The 1821 Mexican independence changed the political structure without changing the practical reality. The Diné negotiated with Mexico much as they had negotiated with Spain, on their own terms, from the ground they knew. The American arrival in 1846, when General Stephen Kearny marched into Santa Fe and declared New Mexico a territory of the United States, changed the situation in ways that took time to become clear. The American government did not understand the Navajo the way the Spanish had come to understand them, slowly and through the written record of priests and merchants who had lived in close proximity for a century and a half. The Americans arrived with a different assumption set. They arrived with the assumption that the land was either cultivated in the European manner or vacant. A landscape across which thousands of sheep moved seasonally, managed by women who owned them and children who herded them and men who defended them. A landscape without fences and without permanent settlement in the Euro-American sense did not read to American eyes as occupied. It read as available. By 1851, Fort Defiance had been built on land that the Diné had used for sheep grazing for generations. The soldiers' horses ate the grass. The soldiers' commanders gave orders about where the Navajo flocks could go. In 1855, a Navajo leader named Manolito refused to move his animals from pasture the fort commander wanted for the soldiers' horses. The commander's response was to kill 60 of Manolito's horses and more than 100 sheep. More than 100 sheep. In a pastoral civilization where a woman's economic standing, her family's security, her children's future was measured in animals, 100 sheep was not a military engagement. It was the destruction of a family's wealth across 2 generations. The Diné remembered these things. They were people who kept records in memory and song and the careful observation of what the Americans did, not what they said. By 1863, General James Henry Carleton, the military commander of New Mexico Territory, had decided on a solution to what the Americans called the Navajo problem. He ordered Colonel Kit Carson to remove the Navajo from their land entirely. Kit Carson was not a monster in the theatrical sense. He was a practical man who understood the frontier and understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, the practical dimensions of what he was being asked to do. He had lived in this country for years, had married into it, had learned to move through it. He knew what the canyons were, and he knew what the flocks were, and he understood, without any room for self-deception, that the only way to force a pastoral people off land they had occupied for 2 centuries was to destroy the thing they could not take with them. In the fall and winter of 1863 and into January of 1864, Carson led his troops through Navajo country in a campaign that targeted not warriors but food. Crops were burned. Wells were poisoned. The peach orchards in Canyon de Chelly, some of them planted in Spanish times and tended for 5 generations, were cut down one by soldiers with axes. More than 5,000 Navajo sheep and goats were killed or confiscated in a single season. When you destroy the sheep, you destroy the blankets. When you destroy the blankets, you destroy the clothing, the warmth, the trade goods, the winter provisions, the economic foundation of every family. When you destroy the orchards, you destroy the stored food that bridges the season between the last harvest and the next spring. You take away the land's ability to support the people even if the people stay. You do not defeat a people who can move and survive on what the land offers. You make the land unable to offer anything at all. The Diné starved. In January 1864, the people who had been holding the canyon walls emerged from their hiding places, reduced by cold and hunger to surrender, and walked down into the arms of Kit Carson's soldiers. What followed was the long walk. 8,500 Navajo men, women, and children were marched nearly 300 miles from northeastern Arizona to a place called Bosque Redondo on the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico. They walked through winter. The army had planned rations for 8 days. The march took between 18 and 40 days, depending on the group. Perhaps 200 people died on the road. More died at Bosque Redondo, a flat, treeless reservation already occupied by Mescalero Apache, with alkaline water that made people sick and soil that could barely support the crops the army insisted the Navajo plant and harvest. The Diné called it Hwéeldi, the place of hardship. In the Spanish records, and in the American records both, there are accounts of what the Navajo brought with them to Bosque Redondo. They brought very little. What they were allowed to bring was not much more than they could carry. But the accounts note, again and again, the spinning whirls, small wooden discs, the simple tools for spinning wool into yarn, tucked into the belongings of women who had nothing else left. The sheep were gone. The looms were ash. The canyons were 8,000 men's miles behind them. But the women brought the tools, because the knowledge was still in their hands, and knowledge needs something to hold on to. They held on to it for 4 years. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who had burned his way through Georgia a few years earlier and understood better than most what the destruction of productive land meant to the people who had lived on it, arrived at Bosque Redondo in 1868 as part of a peace commission. What he found there changed his position on the matter. The Bosque Redondo experiment had failed by every measure the army had been able to apply. The crops failed in the alkaline soil. The Mescalero Apache and the Navajo were enemies confined to the same small reservation. The cost of maintaining the internment was running to over $1 million a year, an enormous sum, and the Diné were dying of disease and starvation and despair in numbers that even the American Army's accounting could not ignore. Sherman became convinced, over the course of several days of negotiations with Navajo leaders at Fort Sumner, that the Diné should be allowed to go home. The lead Navajo negotiator was a man named Barboncito. He was not a war chief. He was a headman, a leader in the older Navajo tradition, a man whose authority came from his understanding of his people's needs rather than from his ability to organize violence. He spoke to Sherman in terms that Sherman, who was a practical man above all else, could understand. The land to the west was where the Diné could live. This land, Bosque Redondo, was where the Diné were dying. The distinction between the two was not philosophical. It was the practical difference between a pastoral people in their own landscape and a pastoral people removed from everything their pastoral economy required. The Treaty of 1868 allowed the Navajo to return. What the government gave each returning family to restart their economy was 2 sheep. 2 sheep, against the tens of thousands that had been destroyed, against the flocks that had numbered by the hundreds per family in the years before Carson's campaign. 2 sheep, and the remnants of a land that had been stripped and burned and left to recover on its own terms for 4 years. What happened next is the part the American myth about the frontier tends to skip. The Diné went home. They walked back to the canyons and the mesas and the high desert that the Spanish priests had watched them read with such fluency, and they rebuilt. They bred from the 2 sheep. They saved the most adaptable animals, the ones whose offspring showed the qualities the Churro had always been selected for: hardiness and resilience, and the ability to survive on what the land offered rather than what a farmer provided. They rebuilt the loom frames. The women, who still held the knowledge in their hands, began again. The blankets the Spanish priests had been describing for a century and a half, the textiles that Pedro Pino had called the finest in the province in 1812, began to appear again in the trade posts that sprang up around the reservation in the 1870s and 1880s. American traders discovered what Spanish merchants had known for generations. A Navajo blanket was worth more than the sum of its wool. It was worth the knowledge that had gone into every choice made in its production, from the selection of the breeding stock to the reading of the dye plants to the decision about which pattern to use and why. The knowledge was not lost. It had been carried through 4 years of Hwéeldi in the spinning whorls tucked into women's belonging bundles, and it had come home and found something to work with. There is a record from 1869, the year after the return, of a trader near Fort Defiance who received the first new woven Navajo textiles from returning families. He wrote that they were rough, that the wool was thin because the animals were so recently acquired and so young, that the colors were pale because the dye plants had not yet been gathered in quantity. But he wrote, and this is the sentence that stays with you: the patterns were perfect. The designs had not been lost. The geometry that had been woven into Navajo blankets for 100 years, the terraced diamonds and stepped borders and bold striping that appeared in no other tradition in the American Southwest, was back in the first textiles made from the 2 government sheep and their immediate offspring. The women had carried it in their minds, in the same place they had always carried everything that mattered, and they had brought it home. The Spanish priests who wrote about the Navajo in the 18th century were not writing about shepherds. They were writing about a system, a human system, built over 2 centuries of intimate knowledge of a particular landscape, of selective attention to what one animal could be made to become, of the transmission of practical knowledge from one generation to the next through the hands of women who owned the animals and the looms and the knowledge equally. The priests wrote about this system with the confusion of men who recognized its effectiveness and could not square it with their training. They had been taught to look for the markers of civilization they already knew: the churches and the fences and the written law. What they found instead was something older and, in the practical dimension of survival in a difficult landscape, considerably more successful. The American government spent several decades and considerable money trying to improve the Navajo flocks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, introducing merino breeding stock to increase wool production for the commercial market. The merino wool was finer. It also required better pasture than the Colorado Plateau reliably offered, was more susceptible to the parasites of the high desert, produced lambs less reliably, and required more water. By 1935, the federal government had become convinced that Navajo overgrazing was destroying the land and launched a mandatory livestock reduction program that is remembered by the Diné as the Second Long Walk. flocks that had been rebuilt from 2 sheep over the previous 60 years, that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, were reduced within a single year to a fraction of that. Animals were shot in front of their owners. The economic framework that the Diné had spent 2 centuries building, that had been destroyed once and rebuilt from almost nothing, was torn apart again. The Navajo-Churro sheep nearly went extinct. In the 1970s, a professor named Lyle McNeil at Utah State University came across a small surviving flock in California, recognized what he was looking at, and launched an effort to recover the breed. The program at Bosque Redondo, the very place the Diné had been imprisoned, now maintains a flock of Churro sheep and has, since 2017, donated more than 180 animals to Diné families who apply each year to receive them. A woman named Nina Toledo, who received 2 sheep in 2024, said that her older sister remembered their grandmother having flocks of nearly 100 animals before the 1935 reduction. 2 sheep again. The number that keeps returning, as if history cannot stop repeating the same lesson until someone learns it. The lesson is not the one the American government was trying to teach. The lesson is the one the Spanish priests kept accidentally writing down in their observations about women who could track a flock across a mesa without looking directly at any individual animal, in their accounts of blankets that kept soldiers alive in mountain winters, in Pedro Pino's grudging professional admission that the Navajo were the best weavers in the province. The lesson is that knowledge outlasts the thing it is attached to. The Churro sheep could be destroyed and rebuilt because the knowledge of what to select for, what to keep, what the land required, was carried in the hands and the memory of people who refused to let it go. The loom patterns survived Hwéeldi because the women who wove them brought the knowledge home in their heads when they were allowed to bring nothing else. The flocks survived the second long walk not because any government program preserved them, but because a few families in remote locations kept their animals out of reach of the federal agents, and because a professor in Utah noticed what he was looking at and understood it was irreplaceable. The Spanish priests who first encountered the Navajo pastoral economy were trying to write about people they had been told were barbarians in need of salvation. They could not help writing something else, because what they saw was not what they had been prepared for. They saw a people who had taken a foreign animal introduced by colonizers, carried it into terrain that same colonizers could not survive in, and turned it into the foundation of a civilization. They saw women who managed wealth and transmitted knowledge across generations. They saw an economic system that outperformed the one the Spanish crown had been trying to impose on the Southwest for 100 years. What the priests wrote, in their careful and often bewildered accounts from the high desert of New Mexico and Arizona, was the truth of what they observed. They could not always name it correctly. They did not always understand what they were seeing. But the record is there, in the archives, patient and precise, and if you read it carefully enough, in between the theological preoccupations and the administrative assessments, you can hear the sound of a flock moving through canyon country in the early morning light, and a woman reading the ground ahead of them, and the particular silence of someone who knows exactly where she is going. The Navajo called the Churro sheep Taadibe, the first sheep, not because they arrived before all other animals, but because they were the first of something that became essential. The first of a way of living that could endure what was done to it and come back. 2 sheep in 1868, 2 sheep in 2024. And still, between those 2 numbers, everything a people knew about how to live in a hard country, passed from hand to hand, carried home, and started again. Remember the names. Remember Menchero, who wrote honestly about what he saw. Remember Barboncito, who negotiated from the ground he knew. Remember the women whose names we do not have, who brought their spinning whirls to Hwéeldi and came home and started weaving again. Remember the sheep, the first sheep, long-fleeced, desert-hardy, carrying in their wool 2 centuries of a people's careful knowledge, built into the fiber the way knowledge is built into anything that has survived long enough to deserve the name. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.